The following presentation was recorded from a previous live event, so if you hear the presenters mention the chat box or asking for questions, this obviously won't apply for today. However, we felt that this content was important enough to share again. I hope you enjoy.
Many things that are important to think about as we work with English language. Many things that are important to think about as we work with English language learners. First, as instructors, we must know that English language learners are learning English as their second language. It's important to give them multiple opportunities to hear the language and to use the language. Also know that there are many sounds in the English language that don't exist in their home language. We should make sure that we help our students to process the sounds, produce the sounds, read and write them. It is also important to know that as children learn their language, they can also learn to read. The English language has 6 syllable types. English learners can benefit from learning the 6 syllable types of the English language. By understanding that structure of the English language, the students will understand when to produce vowels as short vowels, long vowels. It can also help not only their reading, but their writing and spelling. Most importantly, vocabulary is a lifelong learning process. English learners need multiple opportunities to use these new words. The use of what we call morphology, or the word parts, studying those meaning units of the language, very important for English learners. We know that close to 60% of the English language comes from Latin, and many words in Romance languages, such as the Spanish language, are direct cognates, have the same meanings, the same word parts with the English language. Remember that students need to listen, to speak, to hear, to write these words in meaningful context. Our English learners have many resources from their native language to the second language. It's important as instructors of English as a second language learners to figure out what are those connections that we can make and how can we help them achieve their second language and second language literacy.
Some familiar terms that we talked about the last time. She talked about some layers of language, morphology and phonology, the orthography. All are important factors in how all children learn to read, but we'll be looking specifically at what that means for our English language learners. So which brings us to our first poll. And we just have a quick question, and we talked a little bit about it the last time. Which of the following do you think is true? Learning to read in L2 is basically the same as learning to read in L1. Learning to read in L2 is completely different from learning to read in L1. Or honestly, I have no idea because I missed your first section. This is all completely new to me. And if you're wondering, we broke the cardinal rule of ODE templates and presentations. We did not define for you some acronyms and abbreviations. And so L1 refers to the first language, that home language, and L2 refers to second language. And I'll go ahead and launch the poll. So while we're doing that, you can go ahead and click on what you think is the right answer. Yeah, and if for some reason you don't see the poll, just type your answer into the chat box.
Or you could be really daring, turn on the annotation tools and annotate your response by putting a little stamp on it.
We are getting bold with 194 people on.
I know, I don't want 194 stamps. I was just saying, if you can't see the poll, we could add a little something extra there.
All right, let's see here. We have about 78% of the people have responded. Let's give it another, 10 seconds or so and see if we can get a few more to respond tonight.
It's always interesting that we have 450 register, but then
I know
190 show up.
And I ended up leaving registration open this time. So
yeah, that was probably smart because I feel bad. We turned people away last time and then we had.
All right, we're going to go ahead and end this polling and share the results. And yes, 61% of you are correct. Learning to read in L2 is basically the same as learning to read in L1. It's not all that different. Now, notice though, the key word is basically the same, because there are some other adaptations that we need to do in order to ensure that our English learners are successful in acquiring the language of English. So think about a house, right? Every good structure starts with a foundation, okay? And so when we think about the foundation of English, we think about those first few components of the National Reading Panel let us know about, and then also the panel on minority. So we think about the alphabetic principle. We think about phonemic awareness. That is critical for our native English speakers. It is critical for our English language learners, especially when we get into word recognition, where there are some languages where the phonemes of English don't match up with the phonemes of other languages. And so those have to be explicitly taught. We also turn to a strong foundation in phonics. That's how we take those sounds and we attach them to the print that is on the page. And then we put those two together to equal fluent decoding via phonology and orthography. That's the foundation. All learners have to have that foundation. But when we think about how this translates to our English learners, we have to go a little bit beyond the foundation, and we have to provide some extra structural supports to ensure that our English language learners are really getting the full impact. So that foundation it's essential, but it's not sufficient. So I'm thinking about, our friends that are living in Florida. Sometimes they have to put some extra structural work around their house because they're in a hurricane zone, right? And so we have to provide those extra supports for our English learners while at the same time including those foundational skills. The foundation doesn't make the whole house either. So we're providing that basis for instruction.
But the big message really is, though, in an alphabetic language, when it comes to language acquisition, the very same processes apply whether you're learning to read English or another language. So.
Okay, and so here we turn to Stanislaus Dehaene, who tells us and we talk a lot about the reading brain. We talk about it all the time and how we are born, our brains are wired to speak. They are not wired to read. And we have to build those brain circuits in order to have students who are proficient readers. And we may have heard that there's lots of ways to learn to read. However, when it comes to reading, we all have roughly the same brain. Our brain starts out pretty much the same way. And it's what instruction does over time, explicit instruction over time, that really builds those brain networks that thinks about and that helps to really lock in those sounds to those symbols to be proficient readers.
And if you go back to the Padlet from last time, which I have it linked right here, there is a lovely video called The Reading Brain. Feel free to check that out after the fact, if you didn't get a chance to after our first session, which really explains how the brain learns to read and the complexities of that process.
And so again, our L2 readers are requiring additional supporting brain regions during learning. They don't have an already present knowledge of the phonology of English or the semantics of English, the meanings of English. And so we really have to provide instruction that activates those areas, that activates the front part of the brain, where the phonological processing takes place, and also this part here in the middle that is activating the semantics, the semantics and the meaning part and the context part, because they don't come with those already structures of English. And so our instruction, just like it's beneficial for all of our readers, we have to provide those additional supports in the phonology, which we'll talk about in our next session, and then also in those semantic areas, which we're going to really focus on today.
Because really it's about language. It's about building on the oral language skills in order to learn to read.
And so we really do turn to the truth about teaching English learners. And full disclosure, Michelle and I have not had an original thought in about 5 years. And so much of what we are presenting to you and relaying to you is what we have learned over time from Claude Goldenberg and Elsa Cardenas-Hagen. And so we are really presenting all of their, and who?
Antonio Fierro.
We forgot about Antonio Fierro. Yeah, I did my R roll.
You did. I'm so proud of you.
Yeah, so we really do turn to the experts who became experts because they've done the research and they've accumulated the evidence. But we know that with our English learners, like all of our students, we have to teach those 5 components of reading instruction. And notice what's interesting about this graphic is that we are teaching them where there is an emphasis on particular components over time. So with our kindergarten, our first grade students, we are really emphasizing that phonemic awareness and phonics, how that sound symbol relationship is put together, and we make those, that we have that fluent decoding to really practice that fluent decoding. However, we are still building up speaking and listening skills. We're just building that strong foundation. However, as students get older, those 5 components really are still critical. And while we might not be putting as much emphasis, we still do provide instruction in those areas. And again, with our English learners, we are providing that additional support in language. Literacy is not divorced from language. You have to have that schema for language in order to be a proficient reader. And so to really tie and kind of piggyback on this, we are very fortunate this year to have Nancy Hennessy speak to our state about language comprehension and really building a network of comprehension instruction. Because as you're going to find, comprehension is not just one thing. There are many, many strands that lead into comprehension. And so when we are teaching reading and when we are teaching writing, we need to understand language. Think about those layers of language, the phonology, the orthography, the morphology, how etymology comes into play, how semantics comes into play, how pragmatics and discourse, all of that creates this strong rope of reading comprehension, because literacy really is a system of language, and we have to start first and foremost with that. All right. You want to take over, Michelle?
Sure. I can talk about reading comprehension. So reading comprehension, we're going to try to define it for you, but understand that it's a pretty nebulous concept, right? This is not cut and dry as what we first thought. We used to, when I would ask teachers, what is comprehension? They would give me lists of strategies, finding the main idea, sequencing events, retelling events, summarizing. That's not comprehension. So we have to kind of adjust our thinking and shift our thinking a little bit in order to really understand all of the nuance and all of the components of reading comprehension. So first, we have to think of it in terms of the simple view of reading, which is also in Ohio's plan to raise literacy achievement. And when we look at the simple view of reading, which I don't want to spend too much time on because I know Carolyn spent a lot of time on this in session 1, we realize that reading comprehension is the outcome or the product of teaching both word recognition and teaching language comprehension. And when we teach both of these things, we get reading comprehension. But we have to shift our thinking in that we used to believe that if a student was struggling in reading comprehension, we would improve reading comprehension by really hammering home reading comprehension and teaching more and more and more. However, what we realize is that this is the outcome. So we get better reading comprehension by teaching both word rec and language comp. And here's the part where I'm going to break your heart just a little bit. Are you ready? Just be prepared for it. It's not about balance. This isn't about balanced literacy. This isn't about a balance between word rec and language comp. It's about a shifting or a changing emphasis. As our children are younger, or as they are just starting to develop their English, their L2 proficiency, we're going to spend a little bit more time on word recognition over here. However, once they have mastered and developed automaticity with these skills, and David Kilpatrick says many of our children who've had good, solid reading instruction in their L1, especially if we're talking a code-based language like Spanish. If they've had solid instruction in their L1, then they will tend to pick up the code of English a lot easier than if they haven't had that original instruction. So this part here, we're going to spend more emphasis, put a little bit more emphasis in our younger grades. And then if we do a great job of that, then we can shift to putting more emphasis over here on language comprehension as our students get older and once they've mastered this. But we need automaticity with the code, and that's going to be critical in order to shift and put a little more emphasis here. However, we are all in on both sides. If we neglect any one side of the simple view of reading, anything times 0 is 0. And so that will dramatically impact our reading comprehension. So we can use this as kind of a guideline for good instruction, but also as a way of diagnosing issues that our children might be having and intervening appropriately. Because we may have to intervene in word rec, we may have to intervene in language comp, or we may have to intervene in both. Now, you could be wondering, okay, what are the individual subcomponents of these two things? These seem like pretty vague concepts. So that's where we have another theoretical model, and that's the Scarborough's reading rope. So Hollis Scarborough originally developed the reading rope as a way to communicate all of the necessary components of reading instruction. And Carolyn actually mentioned, which I thought was really interesting, that she originally designed this for parents, which I found fascinating. But this model was a way of demonstrating all of the critical pieces of our instruction that must be in place. So I think of the reading rope as, you know, like the nylon cording that holds our seatbelts. You know, that's our seatbelts are made out of. I mean, seatbelts are ridiculously strong, even though essentially it's fabric, right? But because it's all woven together so tightly, seatbelts can save a life. But if there is a break or a fray and one of those threads gets pulled out, the whole thing unravels. And that's kind of what happens with the reading rope too. If we skip any of these essential components of instruction, the whole rope unravels for our children. Or if our students are coming to us missing any of these necessary components, their reading comprehension skills unravel. And so we need to be able to analyze and make sure our core instruction includes this. And if in the case of our interventions, based on student needs, are we intervening in the right places? So this model is 100% aligned with the simple view of reading. In fact, we can overlay them. And here you see word rec, language comp equals reading comp. And although Hollis Scarborough didn't design them to be exactly the same, it was because the research was the research, it turns out they really were beautifully aligned, that we need both word recognition skills and language comprehension skills. So in all of your spare time, where'd mine go? I challenge you to, make yourself a pipe cleaner Scarborough's robe so that you have it by you forever and for always, because don't you want one of these on your desk? Seriously. In order to make sure that you remember all of the essential components. So I have mine red for language comprehension, blue for word recognition. And then, so I have a little question here for you all. Two of my top strands up here, let me get my little drawing tool. So two of my upper strands, I made red and white. Why? Because these two strands for English learners, but also for all students, are incredibly important for influencing reading comprehension. They have such a huge impact on reading comprehension. What two strands in this top do you think? So I'm asking you to unmute your mic and tell me. So you can press and hold your, if you press and hold your space bar and unmute your mic. What two strands in the upper language comp do you think have the biggest impact on reading comprehension? What two strands?
Vocabulary.
Vocabulary, background knowledge.
Vocabulary, background knowledge.
Yeah, vocabulary and background knowledge. Love that.
Yes.
I love it.
So why do we teach reading so much and not science and social studies?
So, oh my God, you are going to love later. You're going to love this presentation. We're getting there.
Almost like you can read our minds tonight.
Oh, don't you worry. It's coming. We need, and honest, so to build that background knowledge and teach that vocabulary, we need to teach in our literacy block, align our instruction to that, to the content areas. In fact, Daniel Willingham has a great video, which I will ask either Dana or Kelly to find, called Teaching Content is Teaching Reading, to put it in the chat. We can put it in the Padlet as well, really explaining why we want to bring in text from the content areas into our reading block to build that background knowledge and vocabulary. So great question. Okay, moving on. So remember, comprehension is the outcome. Comprehension is when all of these strands are woven beautifully together to create that super strong seatbelt-like fabric. So this is what we want to happen for our kids. We want a really strong, tightly woven rope. And today we're really going to focus more in language comprehension. So this is back to the simple view of reading. We're going to focus more in language comp, which includes academic language. There's my vocabulary, background knowledge, academic vocabulary, all those, the narrative language skills, inferential language skills, the ability to write and speak in that language following the rules. So we're going to focus a lot on language comp today, and we're going to look at background knowledge, we're going to look at vocabulary, and we're also going to take a look at language structures, because we know that these can be especially challenging for our English learners. So what is comprehension besides the product of word rec and language comp? I have a couple different definitions to help you. So this one came from Anita Archer, the one and only explicit instruction queen. If you haven't had a chance to watch her present, I highly recommend you do. And so she says comprehension is the act of understanding what you have read, getting meaning from what you've read, and then the understanding and interpretation of what you've read, making sense of it. And when we know a student is comprehending, because it's the outcome, right? We can identify that a student is comprehending when they can read the words accurately and fluently. And I love this. This part is so powerful for me. I'm going to put little, maybe I'll put stars next to it. So a student is comprehending when they can read the words accurately and fluently, when they understand the meaning of those words, especially challenging for ELs, when they have background knowledge, and when they can focus their attention on critical content in the passage. And by the way, that has to be taught too. That's really challenging for any child, but especially our English learners. So we know a student is comprehending when they can do all of these things, but it's the outcome of all of these things. So going back to this, comprehension is an outcome, it's not a strategy. So as we think about those strategies, those are just ways to help our students to dig deeper into a text, but those aren't comprehension. Comprehension is when the student can do all of these things. Make sense? Don't worry, we'll have a part to ask questions a little bit, and it's coming. Okay, so, but we don't want to underestimate the impact of working memory. And I linked in the Padlet this wonderful book study that Dana, I know, is participating in, and I have not had time to participate in, all about the book Literacy Foundations for English Learners. And chapter 3, the recording, I linked in the Padlet for all of you because I thought it was excellent. And one of the conversations in the chapter 3 recording of the book study was all about working memory. So Dr. Eric Treatise was there, and he was talking about the limitations of working memory. And for all students, there's only so much we can handle in our working memory. So our working memory is, we're processing right up here in our frontal lobe and our prefrontal cortex. It's like we're taking new information and we're manipulating it and playing with it. So those of you have your cameras on, and those of you who don't too, take your hand, show me your working memory. Gestures are helpful for all of us. Show me your working memory right up here. It's happening up here in my frontal lobe.
And honestly, depending on how much is on your plate, adults sometimes struggle with working memory also.
Yeah. Even as adults, we can only handle about 7 new pieces of information, which is why Carolyn and I have built in like stopping points to kind of stop and process, because otherwise our working memory can only handle so much too. So we know it's limited for all kids and all adults, but it can be further reduced by the linguistic demands of code switching for our English learners and our students who speak different dialects. So that can put additional strain on their working memory, because if we can handle 3 to 4 pieces right here in this working memory at one time as a little kid, and all of that is taken up with the conversion from L1 to L2 and the translating, it's going to limit what's left now to process and build new vocabulary, to decode words. And so we have this limitation for English learners on their working memory because they're constantly going back and forth. They're code switching between these languages. So how do we help them? And I thought this was excellent. I really loved this advice. He said, we help them by developing automaticity. We need to automatize as many tasks as possible. The easiest one to automatize is the code, which we're going to talk about in our next session. So you want to increase working memory. You can't increase that space, but you can take up other things. You can limit the other things that take up that space, right? And so we can limit the act of decoding from taking up space by automatizing it, which we're going to do in our next session. We can also automatize their knowledge of vocabulary. So if they hear new vocabulary words enough times, we use them in multiple contexts over and over again, speaking, listening, writing, reading. We can automatize their use of the language, right, and the vocabulary. And then also, we want to make sure that we build extra and additional background knowledge to give them things to stick to. All of this is going to free up some space, cognitive desk space in their working memory. So I thought this was pretty fascinating because working memory plays a huge role in our ability to comprehend texts. So we know that reading comprehension is complex. It's much more fluid of an idea than we ever thought. And it's very interactive. It's about this interaction between the reader and the text, right? We can't simplify it to one strategy, one test. It's just not possible. It's not a single thing. So as we're assessing our learners too, we have to think about the complexities that really are reading comprehension, because one test doesn't really give me a full picture of what my English learners know I can do.
And we actually had a conversation about that with the statewide team this morning that said that, and the conversation was that so many of our assessments give the wrong impression that comprehension is one thing, and comprehension is not one thing. And whether it's, we look at learners collectively or especially our English language learners, it is first of all, it's a process that we go through to attain reading comprehension. And there are many strands, and even within each of those strands, there are additional layers that we have to peel away to get at. So we have this false assumption that it's a test or a product that tells us comprehension, and it's a whole layer, lots of layers of different things.
Love that. And so here, once again, we have Torgerson talking about that simple view of reading. In order to comprehend, students have to be able to have language comp. So if we think of the simple view of reading, word rec times language comp, they have to have language comp skills and the ability to accurately and fluently identify words in print. So there's your decoding skills. Reading comprehension is the joint product of language comprehension and our ability to read and decode those words. And so we have to consider this when we set goals for our students, when we plan our EL services and interventions for our students. We need to think in terms of that simple view of reading or Scarborough's rope and make sure that we are touching on both sides and we're identifying which areas our students might need additional practice in. Now, for the case of today, we're going to focus on language comprehension, but know that we have to be able to diagnose based on both sides of the simple view, because reading comprehension is the product of both. Okay, time for you to ask some questions before we move on to the next section. Let's process. Let's get that working memory working.
So maybe there's something that really squared with what you knew before. Like, wow, I knew that. It's so confirming to hear it. Perhaps there's some new information that you learned. You can type it, you can unmute. You all were not shy last week. Yep, background knowledge is vital and it is hard to build. We'll talk a little bit about how to make it a little bit easier. The reading rope. Yep, I can't tell you how many times I've gone through this reading rope, and it really does help to solidify it.
And Janice asked to go back one slide. This slide, Janice? And you have all of these in the Padlet too. You have access to all the slides too.
It's just easier to see it now. Thank you.
You are so welcome.
Teaching strategies. We're going to talk about strategies in a little bit too. I know we've got some Zoom overkill. Let's see.
And we will be talking about sight words, not in this session because this is all about language comp, but in our word recognition session next time, we'll talk a little bit about sight words and how to develop that automaticity. I'm telling you that's coming, I promise. And you're right, it is a language issue that is preventing our English learners sometimes with keeping up. Yes.
Oh, since somebody asked about getting the handouts prior to the session, we make every effort to get the slides.
We were presenting all day, so it just did not work out.
Notorious for making last minute adjustments. So
yeah, so building L1 language comprehension will build L2 language comprehension. Yes, it will. And actually, we have a couple slides that talk about that. Yeah. But yes, building vocabulary in students L1 will actually improve their comprehension in L2 as well. Yep.
Yeah. So there's a question about translanguaging. So Dana or Kelly, do you want to comment on that? The role of translanguaging?
Yeah, absolutely. Translanguaging is great. That builds comprehension. So that's when we're using their native language to build understanding, and that is a great tool to use. So thinking of English learners and strategy, when we're thinking about reading comprehension for all students, there's some of those basic things that we can do that will help all kids, but we need to go that extra mile for English learners and do extra steps to build that comprehension because there's so much they need to learn. So translanguaging and the use of their native language, absolutely.
Yeah, and I'm seeing a couple things come through the chat box of older students having lack of background knowledge in their L1 and in their L2. So now you have that kind of that double whammy that you're working through. You're building their language in both languages, right? Which can add an added stress as well.
Well, I love Brian's comment though about we spend so much time on reading comprehension, and this is what I was hoping your big takeaway would be from that section. We spend so much time intervening on reading comprehension. What does the student struggle with? Oh, they struggle with reading comprehension. That's not the case. We have to go back and figure out what's causing the reading comprehension breakdown. Is it word recognition? Is it language comprehension? Or is it a combination of both? So Paula Scarborough's rope and the simple view of reading are going to help us there, but we can't just push reading comprehension to improve reading comprehension. We've got to drill down and figure out what's causing the problem.
Yeah, and remember, somebody asked about building language at the K2. Yeah, language is everything. Language is the foundation. And language is what helps build that schema to manipulate phonemes and then put those phonemes together to make words. And if you don't have that schema for language, you can decode, but then you can't access that meaning. And finally, the context processor of how our brain really does learn how to read words. So we start, we're kind of flip-flopping, right? We put these in silos of language comprehension and reading and word recognition, but really you've got that foundation of phonology and orthography, and you're decoding the words, but then you have to have that schema for language to figure out, okay, do I know what that word is? And does that word make sense?
Okay,
Right.
I have a question.
An asset and I'm sorry. Hold on 1 second. I'm gonna finish the thought from this that was in the chat, and then yes, absolutely. So I love the question, the comment that their home language is an asset. Thank you, Loy. I think that's awesome, and we need to stress that it is an asset. But at the same time, we also want our children to be able to code switch. We know that children who can code switch are going to be better readers, and so whether we're talking about a second language or a dialect, the ability to go back and forth is going to be really important because standard English is the language of the text, and we want to help them. And we learn to read from speech to print. They're going to be better readers if they understand the oral language of standard English. Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yes, please. I apologize.
Okay, so looking at I've been seeing one thing I really appreciate is, so we've been talking about the science of reading, and I've been going to all these meetings for like over a year when we've been talking about all of this, and it's great, but I really appreciate the fact that now we're taking a really specific look at this and looking at the science of reading and ELs, because some things, like you said, are basic, but it is a different ball. There are some things that are quite different when it comes to that. So when I'm looking at like the two components for, creating reading comprehension. So with my students, I use Haggerty and some other things, but I'm also looking at that chart and I'm trying to, is there other assessments besides Haggerty or, other besides Bridging the Gap, which is also part of Haggerty, that we can use to determine, okay, is it specifically in this area of decoding that we need to look at? Like, because there's those different component pieces. So
Right.
is there other types of ways in which we can
Yes.
Yeah. So
assess to determine that?
if you're talking about decoding, if you can hold on for another week, we will talk about some assessments next week to help you with the decoding piece. If you're talking about language comprehension, and somebody asked this question in the chat box, we can look at that simple view of reading in kind of two buckets. We have constrained skills that are word recognition skills. They are very easily teachable, accessible. We can use an assessment to then determine what a specific area of need is. Language comprehension skills don't exactly work like that. We are looking at more what we call unconstrained skills. And so we don't have those readily accessible assessments that can assess in these nice, neat little buckets like we do. We don't have something that just covers background knowledge, because background knowledge can be just about anything. We can get a list of grade level vocabulary words, but who's to say that that's the list of vocabulary? So there's some things that we can do holistically. We can listen to a student read and have them tell us what they just read. We can give them what's called a maze assessment, where they kind of fill in the blanks of words and see if they can determine what the missing word is, or what word might fit in that particular sentence. We can listen. We can do some observational and collect some observational data where we talk to them, and can they hold a grade level type conversation. Where we get into specific assessments is where we really need the help of our speech and language pathologists, our school psychologists. But we also have to think too, before we go to that part of it, what has the instruction been? Have they had enough instruction to merit the need to go to those further type assessments? Whereas in word recognition, there are readily accessible assessments that a classroom teacher could give at any moment. But what's difficult about language comprehension is that they are unconstrained skills. We just don't have those accessible assessments to help with that. There's some kind of informal ways. Core language makes a lot of different assessments, like the vocabulary screener, a maze, or a closed reading assessment, but we just don't have the assessments like we do for constrained skills.
Yeah, because I'm kind of with my EL kids, we're kind of all over the place, of course. So like I have one student, for example, like he decodes, he reads beautifully, but he has no background knowledge and so that's where he's at. And I think there's a few other things. And I have another student, she can decode with some things, but her case is quite different. So I'm always trying to look at this and say, okay, well, where are we at that, like, what pieces are you missing? And sometimes I feel like that's always the conundrum I'm running into sometimes. So, but thank you.
Yeah, I wish we had a fabulous answer for you, but we don't. And you guys, this group is so good because there's 200 of you, but you guys ask really great questions, which just goes to show you this amazing, vast knowledge base that you have. And so sometimes you're even ahead of us.
Yeah.
But
we don't get to your question, this chat gets saved, and Dana is keeping a folder of everything that is asked in the chat. And when this is all finished, we will have a huge debrief session to kind of figure out if there are buckets of information that we need to explore further. So please don't feel slighted if we don't get to you, but just know that your thoughts and your comments are being noted, and we will eventually think about how this all looks across the state. Because I think somebody said we haven't heard, we hear a lot about what reading instruction should look like, but we haven't had really anything yet specific to our English language learners.
So I just want to, there was a few comments in the chat box about students who don't have literacy skills in their L1s. So some of those decoding skills in their L1. So just to be clear, when we're talking about Scarborough's rope or simple view of reading, it doesn't matter the age of the student. If there's any holes, that's our job to fill in those holes. So I saw somebody say at the middle school level in intervention, they weren't focusing on any of the decoding, if that might have been some of where the holes were. We have to fill that in. That's our job. So it doesn't matter. And we know that we get a lot of adolescent kids who don't have the literacy skills in their native language. And then somebody else mentioned the long-term L's where they're strong in the language comprehension, but are missing some of those decoding skills. So as Michelle said earlier, we need both sides of that equation, and we need to fortify both sides of those equations so that we get that reading comprehension to make success. So don't misinterpret this as these are learned in K2, K3, and then these are learned later. It's wherever they're needed.
Yep. Okay, so this is great. I'm glad we give you this time to think and to process. But let's kind of keep going a little bit, and let's think about how these language comprehensions, how this language comprehension is really starting to develop, and through this development, how it's eventually going to impact their reading. So you all may have seen these stages before. It's really how language is acquired, and how now we're going to use it to really think about how comprehension is going to develop through language. So we have these stages that our learners are going through, and I think it's interesting because we're also going to share with you. Another model next week that talks about phases. And what's interesting is that these phases or stages, we don't have particular ages or grade levels on them because it's really about where a learner is in their acquisition of language. So we can go anywhere from that silent or pre-production stage where a learner might be looking at you and they might not be responding, but they're just taking things in, right? And so you may not know what it is that they're doing. You might have some preconceived perceptions about it, but they're just kind of taking in this language, much like a young child is doing in English. Then we have that early production stage where they're just starting to comprehend this language. It's simple, it's 1 or 2 word utterances. Then we get into now they're really starting to verbalize, and they're starting to hold more words in their working memory. They're experimenting with the language. You can see them experimenting with noun, verb, subject, verb agreement, or complexity of sentences. So we're going through these phases in how our students are acquiring the English language. And we're starting to see how language is ultimately going to fit into comprehension depending on where they are in these phases. Right? And so then we ultimately get into this advanced language proficiency stage where they can fully participate in the academic setting. And that's what we want of all of our learners, right? We want all of our learners to be able to fully participate, whether it's a student in general education, where a student who has been identified with a learning disability, our English language learners. We want everyone to be able to fully participate in that setting by having the level of language necessary to comprehend text. All right. And so when we think about this and we think about how this language is acquired, vocabulary and the structure of our language matters. And so when our learners are learning this language, the vocabulary in their L2 is going to impact how well a reader comprehends the text in L2. So if we are using conversation, in our conversation, advanced language, if we are washing them in words, if we are using read alouds and being very intentional in our reading, in our read alouds, if we're teaching vocabulary, listen, they're going to start to acquire that vocabulary easier, and that's going to impact how well they comprehend text. So when we build our vocabulary knowledge, we want to make sure that we're combining new information with what the learner already knows. Okay, so we're building this mental model, helping them build this mental model, and that's going to help produce this higher cognitive learning. We want to integrate multiple opportunities to make connections to concepts and lived experiences. It's not enough to just teach them a vocabulary word once. They kind of have to learn to know that word really well and know all the layers of language that are contained in that vocabulary word. We have to integrate intentional opportunities for that adult-child language interaction. There has to be that turn taking. I'm going to talk. I'm going to allow my student to talk. I'm going to allow them to ask questions. I'm going to allow them to respond. I'm going to answer back and forth. That's that ping pong effect of language. And we have to think about giving all of our students opportunities to talk with each other, so that they get to hear not only the language of the adults, but also the language of the learners around them. All right, so when we think about what this looks like across languages, and we think about the challenges that our English language learners face, they face the challenge of comprehending abstract and very complex vocabulary words. They are just words on a page. That's why when we talk about that decoding piece next week, we're not just going to simply talk about taking the sounds and the symbols, because taking the sounds and symbols away without having that meaning and context then to further back it up is very challenging. I can decode a word in Italian, or I could try to decode a word in Spanish, but it's not going to mean anything to me because I don't have the meaning and the context. I don't have the background of that language to put that full picture together. So when we provide definitional and contextual information about each word's meaning, and we actively involve the students in the word learning. So if you go and you watch any of the videos with Anita Archer, when she does an explicit instruction vocabulary routine, she is actively engaging the students with the word or with the content. She's having them repeat the word. She's having them turn and tell their partner what the word means. She's having them get up and moving, and they're acting out the word. So it's when we talk about multisensory, that is that multisensory experience that we are offering to our English language learners by offering pictures, giving some visual clues about visual cues about what the meaning is. Not to decode the word, but once the word is decoded, using those pictures for additional meaning and context. And then we enhance our instructional practices that really target those our English learners. And again, what's good for English learners is really good for all of our students. All of those strategies that we use to teach a vocabulary word explicitly really do benefit our native English speakers too, because we have a lot of students who are really language poor, who don't have homes that are rich in language and speaking and listening and reading and writing. So when we talk about knowing a word and kind of going back and thinking about what that other slide means and having multiple opportunities, to know a word is to love a word, right? You have to make a word you have to make words your best friend. You not only have to know their literal meaning, kind of the simple basic definition, but you also have to know how those words are used and how some words are used in a variety of different settings. You have to know the morphological variations of those words. You have to know where the words come from and how the pronunciation perhaps changes when we add certain morphological elements to them. You have to know there's semantic variations that are also based on the morphological variations. When you add a prefix or a suffix to the word, how that changes its meaning. And we also have to know specific concepts, ideas, and knowledge associated with the word. That's that semantic map. So we have to think about connotation and denotation. We have to perhaps think about subject areas where the word might be found. We have to think about whether a word is used more in writing or whether a word is used in discourse, in language, in conversation back and forth. So that's what it means to really know a word. This is what we work with on general education teachers on. It's not just about looking a word up in the dictionary. It's really making that word your best friend and really knowing all the ins and outs of that critical vocabulary. And vocabulary knowledge, having that knowledge more than any other factor, can be attributed to our English learners' academic success or struggles. Once you've decoded the word, if you don't know what that word means, decoding the word, you've decoded it, but that's not going to help you then with the rest of the text. That is what is critical to that reading comprehension. You've got the decoding elements. Now we have to know what those words mean in order to really, truly understand our text.
Hey, Carolyn, I'm going to interrupt here for a second, just because we are getting a couple questions about a few things. And one of them is the nonsense word topic, which I don't want to spend too much time on because this is not about decoding today. Today is about
I think there might be a misconception about about the purpose of nonsense.
Right. So we'll address that next week, but just know that using and teaching, using nonsense words as a tool for assessment is valuable, incredibly valuable in determining our students' proficiency with decoding. And the point that I think it was Wendy that made earlier, that nonsense words are helpful in that over 50% of the syllables in the English language are closed syllables. So if a student can read a nonsense word, they can read more than 50% of the syllables in the English language. So there is benefit, but we're going to table that for next week. The other comment that keeps coming up is the question about running records. And I don't want to go on a tangent about it. I did put the NCTQ document called the 4 Pillars in the chat. Feel free to check it out. There are only 3 assessments that the NCTQ suggests you should not use because they are based on the 3 queuing system. 3 assessments are listed in this document. Running records happens to be one of them. I don't want to, again, get into a whole thing about the 3 queuing system. I just know that it's been disproven in science, and this is a training on the science of reading. And so we don't want to suggest things that aren't based on the science of reading, right? And so the running record is based on the 3 queuing system. An alternative, because I'm all about replacement behavior, so I love that question, Terry. What can you replace that with? An oral reading fluency probe, such as something through an Acadience or an AimsWeb. You can download them for free. They're 1 minute. Those are going to give us wonderful, valid, appropriate data. So, but again, that's going to be more word recognition stuff next time. But I feel bad because the questions just keep coming up. So I'm super sorry, Carolyn.
Well, it's really, it really is all interconnected to the work. And that's why it's hard to parse these things out, because our decoding is so dependent on language. But I did keep saying at the corner of my eye about the nonsense words. And even though we were going to talk about it next week, I'm glad you brought it up, because I think
I don't want people to think we're ignoring them.
Sometimes it's a misconception about how nonsense words are really used and the purpose of them.
Right. Okay. And I don't happen to know that program, Jeanette. I'm super sorry. I'm not familiar with it. But I can, we can stay after like we did last time and answer some specific program specific questions. We did that last time for a little while, and we could definitely do that as well. So yeah, we're going to try to stay more on the language comp topic today, but we want to answer all your questions because we love how motivated you guys are. This part is like so happy. It's just great for us. Okay. Ready, Carolyn?
I am ready. All right, so here's what we need to consider. English. Here's a great big word. We're going to split it up into multiple syllables. English is morphophonemic. It's a morphophonemic language. It represents a code that has both sound and meaning. So we have this sound, the sound system. However, when our sounds are put together with the morphology of a word, those meaningful parts of the word, that can change pronunciation. Okay, it's why sometimes we have that ch sound, like in the word, not natural and nature and educate and education. So that's why our pronunciation changes, which makes the structure of English language complex. We've got phonology in play, combined with orthography in play, and then add to that the morphophonemic elements. Now we've really got a struggle for English learners and native speakers as well. So we want to make sure that with our English learners, and even though we're talking about phonology and orthography, we still need to think about how morphology comes into play with meaning. Because when we're teaching suffixes and prefixes, if we're teaching meaningful roots, that gives students another tool for understanding the meanings of words. Because remember, when you understand the meaning, that helps the overall comprehension of the text. All of this means we have to provide the right kind of instruction. Instruction on cognates to promote text comprehension is perfectly acceptable. We need to bridge that what's known to the what's unknown and make that connection a lot easier for our students. So, a couple of you have made those comments to promote native language vocabulary learning. So, reframe it in the native language if possible, show those illustrations if possible. That's what helps promote language. And then encourage deep processing and analytical thinking during content-enriched vocabulary instruction. So in our content areas, when we are really diving into those tier 3 words, those content specific words, we have to help them process and break down the word, break down the morphological parts and break down the roots and how the roots build off of each other to form the words of the content. And so that deep processing allows for more analytical thinking as they're diving into the content area. All right, so let's think about syntax for just a little bit. We're talking about vocabulary, but it's more than that. It really does go beyond word meaning. We need to think about the arrangement of the words and the phrases. We need to make sure that our students can break down a sentence and find the who and the who. Extremely important. Sentences are all jumbled up and all over the place, but syntax does matter, and the order of the wording does matter. And so we need to be very explicit in how we teach students to make sense of the syntax and how we help them with that ordering of the words, because sometimes the ordering of the words doesn't have that direct one-on-one translation. And so we need to think about how that translation is affecting the overall comprehension of the sentence. And syntax is a subcomponent of grammar. Grammar is important, and we still do need to be teaching grammar. I like to joke, it's not necessarily that old school Catholic grammar where we're diagramming sentences, but students need to know, our learners need to know the basic function of the word. Okay, what is that word doing in our sentence? So it's not necessarily, the list of nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, but it's the function of the word. What role does that word play in the sentence?
Another break for questions.
Whew.
I love Amber has put 2 great resources, Equipped for Reading Success and Improving Morphemic Awareness. So I love, those are 2 resources that I have. Like, seriously, Amber, I could open up my cabinet and pull them out right now. Here's Improving Morphemic Awareness. And my Equipped for Reading Success is so loved, it's in a binder because see the cover too well.
Yeah, both of those we'll talk about next week, but that Improving Morphemic Awareness is really nice because it does dig into meaning. And it talks about the meaning of the roots, and it also makes that bridge to how the morphology impacts the phonology. And so it's fascinating.
So questions so far on what Carolyn's been talking about the importance of vocabulary, connecting to syntax, the impact on English learners. Sheila, Improving Morphemic Awareness, there's one that's Anglo-Saxon, which can be started in really young grades. You could use it in 1st and 2nd grade with the Anglo-Saxon book, which is a lighter blue. And then there's the darker blue, which I've seen people start as young as 3rd grade, but I actually do some of the drills with my 7th grade daughter because it's just super helpful.
So I have a question just to, one's been mentioned in the chat too, but when we talk about, it's this, I understand that language comprehension is nebulous and it's difficult to wrap our arms around, but understanding that vocabulary instruction is this massive barrier for English learners. How do we teach that systematically and monitor that progress? Because I think that is why the decoding and word work end up being perhaps overemphasized, because it is much cleaner to assess and to teach systematically and then to monitor progress. And so how do we maintain that balance? What's a good approach to that?
We're going to actually model some great vocabulary instruction in a little bit. I promise. That's why I just texted Carolyn, like, we got to get past the nuts and bolts to get him into the good stuff. So we're going to model some really good vocabulary instruction for you, but then also know that, vocabulary instruction is best when it's connected to the text the students are reading. So whatever they're reading in core instruction, if you can pull some of those words and then offer explicit instruction in those words. Obviously, I love, Dana first showed me the Kate Kinsella academic language books. I love them. I think they're excellent. They're a wonderful tool and resource. I highly recommend them. But we also know, and in my favorite book, believe it or not, I like this book for teaching vocabulary better than the Beck book. Just don't tell her that because she's really amazing. But I love this vocabulary handbook. It's all really great strategies for teaching vocabulary. It's just super student or super teacher friendly, student friendly, immediate I could use activities. And so I'm a really big fan of this book for strategy wise. But when choosing vocabulary, you could have something like the Kate Kinsella books by grade level. But I also really love just whatever they're reading in their course, in their classes, pulling vocabulary from that. It sticks when it's applied and when it's used over and over and over again. So once you know the routine, which we're going to show you for explicit vocabulary instruction, just picking the words from text is going to be best for our kids. Terry, the resource was the vocabulary handbook from CORE. I think somebody put it in there. Yeah, Carolyn did. Does that answer your question, Ben?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. And yeah, I love Kate Kinsella's work and Beck's work, among others. So it's not so much what are the strategies for teaching. I guess the struggle is, and I totally agree, contextual instruction of vocabulary as it's encountered in text has so much power. But yes, again, how do we do that systematically so that we can then monitor progress? And I guess that's a piece that I feel like is a real challenge when building language. And right. So welcome thoughts about that.
It's because it's unconstrained. It's hard to manage that progress. Although I like maze assessments, they're a good progress monitoring tool for that. So again, good assessments that you can download for free from Acadians.
Ben, what grade level what age are your learners?
Well, I work with teachers working with kindergarten through 12th grade, so across the range.
Yeah, so if you have if you're working with older learners, there's also a book called Word ID that can be a measure of academic content vocabulary. It's more for middle school and high school though. It's not a book to necessarily what words to teach, but it can kind of give you an overall picture as to the level of knowledge they have about particular words.
Okay, and then someone just asked if they have a district that expects them to teach vocabulary entirely removed. I love the Kate Kinsella academic language toolkits, that's been said. But I also, anything from 95% group is aligned to the science of reading. And they have a vocabulary surge, which really teaches morphemes to teach vocabulary. So Ben, there's your scope and sequence, or is it Shayna or Shauna? Shayna, you'll also have like kind of a scope and sequence to follow. Anything from 95% group is based on the science of reading. It's very explicit. Everything they sell is very explicit as well. And so I'm a big fan of this. And then I also have one other resource I like. It's called Teaching Vocabulary Through Morphemes. Now I got to remember where I put that one. But Teaching Vocabulary Through Morphemes also kind of has a scope and sequence. Yes, you're right. 95% group is not cheap, which is a problem. I'm not going to disagree with you.
You're not going to lie.
Okay, yeah, I can't find my Vocabulary Through Morphemes book, but that's another really great book. Just Google it. It's excellent. I believe that's
you only have a few books back there behind you.
I know it's pathetic. Like it's just a mess. But Ben, that might help. Shayna, that might help you too if you need that. But always, whenever possible, connect it back to text, which we're going to model a little bit here. And we're moving on.
Okay, you're up.
Yes, you might have to put these all back in. Yeah.
Yes, we will try to curate all of these resources that we have mentioned back onto the Padlet. So eventually you'll have all of them there.
Okay, so we're going to talk about effective language instruction for English learners. And eventually we'll get to some modeling of that. We're going to try and pick up the pace to kind of get you to that. So here we go. So when it comes to effective reading instruction for English learners, we know that we have to tap into their L1, their first language, in order to help strengthen vocabulary and comprehension. The research is really clear on that. And when we are reading in English, we want to focus on knowledge and word meaning. We want to, we know those two upper language comp strands, background knowledge and vocabulary, are going to be strongly related to reading comprehension. Offer immediate explicit feedback and provide opportunities for students to discuss. Speaking is the neglected standard. We want our students to be able to interact with one another and with us around the text. And then make sure we provide that explicit instruction. And when we talk about explicit instruction, it gets a bad name because people think that's only the teacher talking. Good explicit instruction, students are doing talking too. So explicit instruction doesn't mean just teacher, it's teacher led, but students are involved and active participants in talking as well. So when it comes to explicit instruction, that student interaction is going to be really critical. Anita Archer is the guru for explicit instruction. If you haven't been through an Anita Archer training, you have to. She's awesome. And most of the SSTs have trainers who can do explicit instruction training here in Ohio. We trained about 30 some different people to be explicit instruction trainers. Another, an intervention that came up in a lot of the articles and such that we've been reading was an intervention that was done by Vaughn back in 2006. And it was done in first grade. And what they found was this intervention wasn't designed specifically for English learners, but English learners made significant progress. And in this, what they did was they had explicit decoding instruction, but then they also, as they were reading text, they clarified the words and the content with visuals, gestures, and expressions, not as tools for decoding, as tools for meaning making. Any of the words and the directions were immediately defined for students. So what either translated or defined using another term to help them understand what they were supposed to do. 2 to 3 words were taught per day as part of this intervention. They were provided with direct instruction in how English language is used, so the syntax. They had lots of opportunity for student response, and students were involved in story retelling, so that oral language retell of the text that they were reading. The text that they used in this particular intervention was a mix of decodable text and then grade level text. So a really interesting study that found huge gains for not just struggling readers, but also for English learners, which I thought was really fascinating. So we shared that citation as well. The other thing when it comes to effective language instruction or language comprehension instruction has to do with using text. So we want to make sure that we have before, during, and after reading strategies. We all know that we can't just hand students text and go, have at it, have fun, there you go. We want our students to be reading complex text, but we have to provide some instruction in that. And that part is very explicit. So before reading, we're going to tell them why we're reading the text. And my most favorite reason is because it's part of a unit that we're using to build knowledge. So yesterday we read this text about this topic. Today we're going to read this other text about this topic. Or we're going to read a narrative involving that particular topic. We're going to talk about the type of text using a variety. That 50-50 split we know is important. Connect to background knowledge. Text sets are a wonderful way to build background knowledge, but we need to connect to all the other things that we're doing to build that background knowledge. Pre-teach the vocabulary. That's also a before reading strategy that's important. And then talk about the language structures. Syntax matters. Syntax is challenging for our students. Carolyn and I train teachers all over the country, and I found that syntax is challenging for teachers too. When I ask teachers the difference between a phrase and a clause, many of them can't tell me. So we know that syntax needs to be addressed, and before we even open up the text, I'm going to pull sentences out. I'm going to talk about phrases in that sentences. If there's multiple clauses, I'll talk about the clauses in that sentence. We'll make connections in terms of, is it a complex or a simple sentence or a compound sentence? So we're going to talk about the language structure of multiple sentences from the text before we dig into it. And then during reading, this is something that's critical for all students, is to purposefully plan. So this is an opportunity for co-planning between English teachers of ELs with their general ed counterparts. Purposefully plan where we're going to pause within the text and talk. Where are we going to pause and ask questions? Where are we going to pause and give our students an opportunity to make predictions or to share their visualization of what they're reading? So that's all happening during the reading. And this is has to be purposefully planned at the different places we stop. And then after reading, we tend to think, oh, we'll just assess. But that's not what we want to do. After reading, that's where we're going to use those wonderful graphic organizers, which are going to be super helpful. And if you have not had a chance to watch any of the free trainings from Joan Sedita on 2-column notes and top-down topic webs, I highly recommend them. They are awesome. And she really gives practical examples of how to use those. Or Joan Sedita. And I'm sure that someone, either Dana or Carolyn, can put that in the chat. She offers a lot of free ones. And there's multiple recordings of her sessions on 2-column notes and top-down topic lists.
And she has also come to speak at our Literacy Academy. So you'll probably find some of her recorded sessions on the Literacy on Demand site that was posted earlier in the chat, but is also linked in the Padlet.
And as we check for understanding, know that we have to think beyond the multiple choice test. We want to have discussions, opportunities for them to write about the text. I mentioned Writing Matters is a really wonderful book for teaching writing, but I'm also a huge fan of the Writing Revolution. I think ELs would very much benefit from that very explicit instruction in syntax connected to text, connected to content. So Writing Revolution training can be done for math teachers, science teachers, social studies teachers, ELA teachers, elementary, all the way through high school. But it teaches the syntax and language structure and how to teach and connect it to the content that the kids are learning. So I love Writing Revolution because it's kind of a twofer. It builds background knowledge and it teaches that language structure. So we just put this in here. I don't want to spend too much time on it. I want to move on. Oh my gosh, Donna just says they're using the Writing Revolution for the entire school. I'm so jealous of your school. I can't wait to hear how their data is, because they shared with us a school in Brooklyn that used it at the high school and completely changed their data. So I thought that was pretty fabulous. Okay, I'm going to move on from this just because I got to keep on keeping on. Okay.
So before you move on, Michelle, one of the things I did want to address, we talked in the last session about a lot of what we're talking about. You might be thinking to yourself, well, I only have my students for like 30 minutes, 3 times a week, and I have to deal with, I have a caseload of 80 students and I have to go to multiple buildings. So please know that we know of your struggles. We are not suggesting that any of this is anything that you can even attempt to do by yourself. A lot of this does have to do with a systemic response to instruction in our districts and our schools. And it's how our districts and our school leaders really work to ensure that the right scheduling is taking place, opportunities to plan, opportunity to co-plan, opportunities to co-serve, thinking about the instruction. So this isn't on your back. If you are an instructor of English learners, please know that these are the things we talk about statewide for all of our learners. And we include the conversation about English learners in with that conversation as well. So our general education teachers are hearing this same message as well. So this is not just to be put on the backs of you, but it's also revolves around a systemic response. And we need to think about the systems that are in place to support our learners and support our instructors across the schools and buildings. So just know that if you're typing that in the comments and in the chats and you're thinking about it, we know we've had these conversations, and this again is a piece of the next part of the puzzle for all of us is how we really get this into the larger, more global conversation. Okay, Michelle, sorry, I wanted to kind of get that across because it was coming through there.
Right. And just because this is the best practice for core instruction, that means it's even more important for us to do it in our limited 30 minutes twice a week, because these are the most important components for English learners as well. So you're going to go deeper with it. And yes, we want everyone to do this in core instruction as well, but we also want to make sure that this is part of your interventions too. Okay, vocabulary. We're going to, like I said, we're going to touch on vocabulary, background knowledge, and language structures today in our last 40 minutes of the day. So I'm going to go a little faster. Here we go. So vocabulary, we know, is one of the best predictors and influencers of reading comprehension. So we want to teach vocabulary explicitly because it's only going to help reading comprehension. So how do we do it? Well, we have to teach it explicitly. We can't just say, look this up in a dictionary and then write it in a sentence or hope that they gain meaning from context. It doesn't work that way. We have to provide explicit instruction. And with ELs, we have to provide explicit instruction with a lot of different types of vocabulary. So let's talk about the different tiers of vocabulary. Before I kind of review this, I just need to get an understanding from you guys is how many of you are familiar? Go ahead and raise your hand. How many of you are familiar with the 3 tiers of vocabulary?
Yeah, you can use your features, your participant features.
I'm seeing some hands up here.
So that is good to know that you have knowledge about this.
Good, because that way I can go quickly through this part. Cool. So Isabel Beck, like I said, she wrote the amazing book, Bringing Words to Life. And I do love that book, but I also really love the core reading book, vocabulary handbook too. But she really separates vocabulary out as 3 tiers. We have tier 1 words. Those are kind of the words that we use in everyday conversation. Tier 2 words are academic language. And so those are the words that could be used across content areas. And so they're big bang for your buck words, right? They're gonna help me in the text I'm reading today, but I could use them in a lot of other contexts. So these are your biggest bang for your buck words. Tier 2 words are the ones you're going to want to spend the most amount of time on because they're going to help our students in any content area. So back to Ben's question about if I have a scope and sequence of words, if you do, you want to use it for academic vocabulary because they can be used in any subject area. And then we have tier 3 words, which are content specific. So those are the words from English, or I'm sorry, from math, from science, from social studies, geography, very specific to the content area. Now, all 3 of these are important. Our students need to know all 3. But for non-English learners, tier 1 words, I never have to teach because my kids, they just know them. So for most of the teachers that Carolyn and I train, we say, well, you don't have to worry about teaching those tier 1 words, your kids know them. But for English learners, do they know the tier 1 words? The everyday language, house, dog, cat, church. This is where I want, unmute your mics. Yes or no? Do they know, English learners, do they know?
No.
No.
Nope.
They might know them in their L1, but they don't know them in English. So the added layer for teachers of English learners is that you have to teach all 3 of these tiers. Now for tier 1, you're not going to spend as much time. So I do liken this still to what Isabel Beck says, a light touch with tier 1. Because very often I could provide some sort of a picture or image to help them connect the word. Or if I know their native language, I can just translate it for them and then they understand that word and the meaning of it. So these more common words, these tier 1 words for English learners, I do have to still teach them, but I don't have to spend huge amount of times teaching them because once I can help them with the translation, they know what the word is. Tier 2 words and tier 3 words are still words that we're going to have to spend most of our time teaching. And like I said, academic language, big bang for your buck because we use it in all content areas. So when it comes to teaching these words, I want to kind of take you through the vocabulary routine. Before I move on, any questions about the 3 tiers? Looking in the chat. And ELs will have gaps in tier 1. Yeah, exactly. Okay, well then I'm going to move on to the routine. So we took this routine from Anita Archer because she's the best when it comes to explicit instruction. And I find this is helpful no matter what grade level you're teaching, no matter what population or subgroup of student you're teaching. This vocabulary routine is helpful for all students. So I've got, I'm going to take you through all 4 steps and I'm going to model it using a word from this particular 7th grade text. And the word we're going to use is catapulted right here. There it is. So this is a poem from a 7th grade text, and we're going to talk about this word following the Anita Archer routine, vocabulary routine here. Here we go. Step 1, I'm going to connect to phonology and pronunciation. Why? Because that's how we store the word, and we need to make that connection to their oral lexicon, or if they don't have one, we have to develop an oral language lexicon for them for this particular word. So I'm going to start with that connection to pronunciation first. So in this particular case, the word is catapulted. Catapulted. 4 syllables. Ready? Let's do those syllables, everyone. Unmute your mics. Here we go. Catapulted. 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 I know, Dana, it sounds funny with 200 people, but bear with me. It's a little easier with a class, right? So we start with the pronunciation. Then I'm going to specifically connect it to the orthography and the morphology. And I'm going to do this on my whiteboard here. You guys see that okay? Okay, so I'm going to scoop the syllables, and you don't have to turn on your mics, but as I scoop the syllables, you're going to read them. Catapulted. And we can talk about the different components of orthography. For example, how we have this wonderful schwa syllable here. Is a schwa syllable, and it just says and it's represented by the letter A, but the sound is just, it's not an A, a long A sound like it should be, it's just So catapulted. Then the next thing I want to do is also connect, if at all possible, to the morphology in this particular word. So I can talk about, very nice. I know, don't you want to be a schwa? They're never stressed. ED is a suffix, so that's why we're talking about the morphology. So here I could say in English, I have this word catapult, and you get a lot of bang for your buck when you focus on the morphemes, because if you provide explicit instruction in the morphemes, then they're able to apply it to new words that they've never seen before. So here we have catapult, and then we have this suffix ed, which means it happened in the past. So ed means it happened in the past, but my verb is catapult. And I can give you a little bit more information about this particular verb because I think this part's fascinating. I love to utilize the resource Edim Online. Edim Online is like my go-to whenever I teach vocabulary to kind of help me make sure I talk about all the necessary components of the language. And for this particular word, it's taken from Latin cata. So here we have Latin cata, which has multiple meanings, but means either down or through. And that, if you think about that, as we're going to start to define this word, down or through really kind of explains what we do when we catapult, because I have a gesture for that, catapult. So down or through something.
Oh, Michelle, we're losing the bottom part of.
I see it. Thank you. Okay, and then we have pull, and pull again from Latin or from Greek, because it's actually in both, which means to toss or to throw. So I've got this word that means to toss, down or through, and it happened in the past tense. So I love using Edim Online to kind of help me find this, because I'm not going to lie, I didn't know this all on my own. I had to look it up. Just like I do for, every word I go to teach. And that's why sometimes even the best programs don't have all this fabulous information. So after I focus on the orthography, I'm going to talk about the morphology of that particular word. And then I'm going to talk to them about the word's meaning, but I'm going to do it in a way that's descriptive using student-friendly definitions. So when I'm catapulting, so if I catapult, which is my verb, I'm going to move quickly and I'm going to launch or fly through something. So when I catapult, I launch it, I fly, I go. And if you think about it, when we are going through or we're tossing, that is kind of like we are catapulting something. We're going through or we're tossing something. And yes, word walls, Mackenzie, are awesome and a great way to teach vocabulary. Absolutely should use them. We just should change them with each new topic, unit, or theme of words that we're teaching. And then I also, in addition to having a gesture where I have my students gesture for catapulted and catapult, I also want to have pictures, and we call this dual coding. So we have an image that goes with it and a gesture that goes with it. So the gesture is called a kineme, and then we also have the dual coding through the picture. Just to give examples, so here I have a catapult, which is going to toss this poor little guy. He's going to toss him forward and through, or I could catapult from the starting line, and I'm going to go quickly through and from the starting line. So it's really important that we offer multiple explanations, not necessarily definitions. And that was something that Marzano talks about, Beck talks about. It's not about defining the word as it is explaining the word. So then I'm on step 3 now. We did the words meaning. We want to give some examples. So if I'm going to go very quickly from the starting line, I'm going to catapult forward. Or if I'm going to throw something, I might catapult it across the room. If I walk very slowly and leisurely, am I catapulting from the starting line? If I walk slowly and leisurely, am I catapulting? No, not so much. Not so much. But if I go very, very quickly, if I'm in a race and I line up and I'm getting ready to go, if I go very quickly, I'm going to catapult myself from the starting line, in which case that would be an accurate use of the word. So we want to offer as many examples as possible. And if I didn't have 200 of you in the room, I could have you unmute your mic, and each time I pause, I could ask you to insert the word catapult. We want to use catapulted, catapulting, catapult as much as humanly possible. Use multiple morphemes in order to change the word a little bit. That will actually help our students to build their language. Word walls are, yeah, and you could do a personal word wall as well, Mackenzie. That's absolutely, I call them vocabulary logs though at that point. If we're talking about vocabulary and not decoding, then yeah, a personal word wall, but I like to call them vocabulary logs in their notebook where they write down the vocabulary as we're learning it is helpful. Okay, so that's the 4 steps for teaching vocabulary. How'd I do on that? Clarification? Additional information? Helpful, not so helpful? Now, it's really important when it comes to purpose too, to Carolyn's point. We make sure that we pull words again from text. We want to give our students opportunity. We can't just teach the word and forget about it. They have to have then opportunities to use the word in speaking, reading, and writing. So if we have this connected to their text, they can go back to the text and they can read the word in context because we've taught this before the lesson. But then I'm also going to do even more activities. So another activity I could do after I've taught the word, read it in text, the next day, maybe I'll provide them with some sentence starters. And I'll say, okay, here's 2 sentence starters. Use the vocabulary words and your information that you learned from the text in order to complete these sentences. So the runner blank. So now they've got to use information from the text and the vocabulary word in order to finish it. Or in this one, when something is catapulted, it blank. So I'm teaching them syntax, but I'm also teaching them the vocabulary word, and I'm building the knowledge of the text or texts I've read. I already mentioned that I use dual coding because I had a gesture or visual, which we called a kineme, but then also having those pictures. That's called dual coding, and it's super helpful for all kids, not just English learners. So vocabulary, we have to have lots of exposure. When we have lots of exposure with retrieval practice, including little mini quizzes are helpful. We call that interleaving. And so we want lots of interleaving of the vocabulary words. I teach catapulted on Monday. I still need to be talking about the word catapulted on Friday. I need to have sentences or maybe mini quizzes or things where are opportunities to discuss. I love Flipgrid is a good example where I could say, oh, now that I've taught this word, I want you to create a little video on Flipgrid using this particular word. So we want to have multiple exposures, and someone said at least 11. Beck says 12 to 15 exposures. That's for a typical child. For English learners, we're going to need even more exposures, right? Use this in reading, writing, and discussion. I think I've already taught about that. There's our explicit piece. Pre-teach it prior to reading a text. And this is one thing that's very specific to English learners. You can substitute easier words in your explanation to help students learn the academic language. So use those easier words to explain the academic language, knowing that we want them eventually to use the more challenging word, but we call that their student-friendly explanation. Okay, I need to move on. So these are like the checklist for when we're teaching vocab. These are the must-have pieces. because I want to get them to the complex text activity, which I think is super helpful. You have to have a connection to text. Sorry to whoever asked that question earlier, it really is the most helpful thing. Explicit introductions to those words that use all layers of language. So you noticed phonology, orthography, morphology. I touched etymology. I had language of origin in there too. We want to touch on all those layers. Robust vocabulary exposure through read alouds is going to be critical. Have lots of opportunity to use the words and multiple exposures, at least 12 to 15. I know, Anna, I just learned interleaving not too long ago, and asked Dana and Carolyn. I try to use the word whenever I can now, because you know you have to say the word so many times to make it yours. And I want interleaving to be part of my vocabulary going forward.
Yeah, so there's two books that really talk about interleaving, How We Learn by Stanislas Dehaene, and also Make It Stick.
Oh, look, and I've got those right here.
Yeah, there you go. Great,
Okay.
Great professional resources to kind of build to your knowledge.
Let's go to language structures, because this part goes fast. Carolyn, you want to talk about language structures?
Yeah, I can. So, you know, when we talk about the structure of our language and that use of syntax, that really helps us to be better readers, but it also helps us to be better writers. Taking a look at model text and mentor text. And that's what facilitates that better writing, helping students to deconstruct a sentence. Really what it all boils down to is when you're given a sentence, let's think about where the who is, where the do is, and let's build off of that. We teach those concepts using that logical, sequential approach. Start teaching fragments and the difference between a fragment and a sentence. Take a fragment, turn it into a complete sentence. Start adding other words, other functions of words in to help build and expand sentence. Okay, so it's that function over form. It's not about this is a noun and this is a verb, but what's the purpose of that noun and what's the purpose of that verb in the sentence? And again, we want to connect it to that writing and to that reading. We want to make it about something. And so teaching that through that content really does help to make it stick. You're building content, but you're also developing that knowledge of and that further helps with the reading comprehension, but also it helps them with their writing because it's teaching them and showing them what those good expanded sentences look like and sound like. All right, and so there's some language considerations, right? You know, so we use Spanish as an example an awful lot, just because that's the language that we see the majority of the time, not all of the time. Many of you have learners in your classrooms that come from a variety of different languages and cultural experiences, but we use Spanish as an example, and we think about the linguistic features and what it means in the Spanish language, and then how we transfer from that L1 to that L2. So that link is, we won't take a lot of time to do that, but just a reference for you that you have, that when you go into the Padlet and you bring up the PowerPoint, you have access to it.
And yes, the writing revolution does really focus on this beautifully. So.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And so one of the things that, you know, that we like to think about is the use of pronouns, and how pronouns, even though they're these 3 and 4 letter seemingly simple words, they can cause a lot of issues for our readers and our developing readers, whether you're a native speaker or an English learner. So identify the pronouns. So Michelle's brought up some animations to help us just quickly. Now, think about the referent. What does that pronoun replace? What's the noun that it refers back to? And when you find it, I want you to think about where it is in relation to the pronoun.
Oh, by the way, unmute your mic or type it in the chat. Let's start with this first one, he. Where is it? What's it referring to?
Aloric, the author.
Yeah, the author, Oliver Luke. Yeah.
So here we just see Delory, but where do I might have to go farther back.
You have to go to
Oliver,
which is her
Delory. Yeah, the author at the very beginning.
At the very beginning. So look how far removed the pronoun is from the noun that it refers to. They have to go all the way back. Remember we talked about that working memory? How much working memory, how much memory is being used to now remember, oh yeah, I did read about that Oliver Luke Delory, and it's way back. And not only is it way back, we've now separated and put into play his first name with his last name. Okay. All right. What about them?
That one's a little easier.
Wild places.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Wild places.
Yep. But yeah, pronoun reference can wreak havoc. They can wreak havoc on English learners, learners who are maybe have poor language. So think about how we use and how we teach pronoun references, and we got to draw explicitly to that. Okay.
Let's erase all that. Sorry about that.
Okay. Again, connect to text. These aren't just random sentences that we put onto a screen. These examples connect to a text that we have been using with our students. Michelle actually put the link to the text in the chat. If you have access to News ELA, you can go ahead and find it easily. You have to make an account. It's a free account. Don't worry about that. But we connect all of these examples to the text and the content that we are studying.
So this activity could just be really quick. You have the students underline the complete subject. So experts, Norwegians, time in the outdoors, have them do that. But I'm using sentences I made up from the text. And that's the helpful part because it's going to build their comprehension skills.
Yep. And then they can come up with their own well-developed subject. But remember, it's still connected to the text. They're not just random sentences that we threw out. So what can make getting outdoors challenging for many people? We have to think about the function of the word. What kind of word are we going to have to put in there, and what's it going to do to that sentence?
And I wish I could tell you, Janice, I was familiar with read theory, but I'd be happy to look at it. I don't. I pull a lot of my text from ReadWorks, usually more than anything. But this one I happened to see on News ELA and I really liked it. So that's why these activities are from that particular one. But I don't know the other one. We want to give you some practical ideas that you could use. So after you read a text, you have them develop the subjects. You just give them sentences where they have to put in a well-developed subject.
Yeah. And oops,
you may go back.
Oh, no. I was looking at my slides and I skipped a slide. Yeah. So think about all the grammatical elements that we are putting into play here. Now you're combining sentences. You're taking two seemingly simple sentences, and now let's combine them into a more well-developed sentence. And so we're combining. So now we're thinking about how this is going to transfer to their overall reading, but now also think about what this is going to do to their overall writing ability. And again, this all goes back to explicit instruction. We're doing lots of modeling. We're doing lots of opportunities for practice. And then we're giving them the opportunity to do this on their own. And now look at how complex this particular activity is. You really have to know quite a bit about the topic in order to do this, but it's all through that explicitness of reading the text, taking a look at the pronoun references, really thinking about combining those sentences. But it's all about explicit instruction. We have to model, and then provide lots of opportunities for practice so that they can then go and try those things on their own. Whew.
I know, girl. We got a lot.
So here's the thing, we still have a lot more that we need to tell you and talk to you about. So we were just kind of, thinking where this is all going to go. Our last session is actually kind of a putting it all together session. So the things that we really have kind of rambled through here tonight, like all of these activities on syntax, those are things that we can look at in our last session together in that putting it all together section. So rest assured, if you see some slides in the handouts and we didn't get to those, our brains kind of work in mysterious ways. We always have a plan in place if we don't get through content. But before we get to our final thoughts, we're curious as to any comments or questions. I know that the chat box has been blowing up for quite a while, but anything that you'd like to share or comment on? Yeah, I'm assuming like a student services manager is someone perhaps a little higher up than where you might be. So that's great. Yeah, anytime you can put this into the hands of your leadership, that is going to make all the difference. We do a particular training where we spend probably the first hour of the training talking about the role of leadership and how we have to get this information in the hands of our school leaders because we need them to make these larger systemic changes.
Okay, ready to move on to background knowledge?
I think we are. We got about 10 minutes, so.
Oh man. Okay, go fast.
Oh, you want me to-
Okay.
Okay, yeah, background knowledge. So there's actually been lots of chatter about background knowledge and the role of background knowledge. Please don't get the impression that background knowledge is not, background knowledge is huge. It is critical. However, remember that changing emphasis. Remember the strands of the reading rope. Background knowledge in and of itself is not the only factor that leads to reading success. So background knowledge does play a critical role, but we have to think about the role that it plays within the reading rope. So consider that when you are planning your lessons. All right. We want to make sure that we have lots of opportunities for our students to develop some background knowledge. Reading aloud is an excellent way to do that, especially with our young children and our students who have not yet mastered the code well enough to access those complex texts on their own. So reading aloud stimulates that oral language, gets them to hear those complex language structures, gets them introduced to vocabulary, and this goes for native speakers and our English learners. It builds that background knowledge. If you're reading books, if you're doing read alouds that are built on themes and text sets, that further enhances that background knowledge because you're reading about all types of topics. And so there is value in text sets. We'll put into the Padlet, if we didn't already, Achieve the Core has an amazing resource where it helps you build text sets and helps you build kind of a stair-step approach to topics and to themes. And it's a wonderful way from preschool all the way on up to 12th grade to really develop this knowledge. It helps their background knowledge, helps their vocabulary, helps to further solidify those sentence structures that they need to have to comprehend. All right. And we really want to think about how we use grade level text sets. Our students need to hear the language of the grade level. They also need to hear the language beyond the grade level because we have to build those strong muscles. We have to build that strong brain. We have to get them in the habit of hearing those structures so that when they have to go in and navigate those complex texts on their own, we've built up a good solid foundation that connects vocabulary, background knowledge, and language structures in order to do that.
Okay, so before we go into this next activity, I'm going to warn you all right now that this might cause some cognitive dissonance. So just do me a favor, and honestly, there's brain research on this. I need you all to turn on your cameras for a second and smile. The fakest smile you can do. Just make it fake. Fake it till you make it, people. Come on. I want to see some smiles, fake smiles, because even when we fake a smile, we still get the little release of happy hormone. Okay, Anna, that does not look happy now. Come on, girl. We still get the release of those happy hormones, and I'm going to need you to have some happy hormones before I come through here and cause some cognitive dissonance. Let's just say that. So everyone's smiling. Yay. Remember, we love Michelle and Carolyn. Yay. Okay, here we go. Here comes the tough part. Okay, so I know that a practice that many of us have used for years and years, myself included, recovering intervention specialist, get it, high school level as well. One of the practices we have used to help struggling readers, struggling English learners, and struggling readers in general is we have given them simpler texts. We have given them lower level texts at their level in order to help them. It turns out the research does not support this. If you want to close the gap, we have to give kids grade level text. Continuing to give kids text that is below grade level actually perpetuates the gap in vocabulary, which we know vocabulary for English learners, huge predictor of comprehension, huge influencer. It causes what we call the Matthew effect. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. So if the good readers always get really high level text with great vocab, those rich get richer, and the kiddos who are struggling, if they always get low level text, the poor get poorer. And I'm gonna give you a really good example. So if this is an equity issue here, this is all about equity. I'm gonna give you an example. So I went to New ZLA. I love New ZLA. Went to New ZLA, found a text. It was about the owl in the New York City Christmas tree. Here we go. So I pulled out the grade level text, 5th grade. And by the way, these texts are all in your Padlet, so you can see them. So if you want to see the text, go to the Padlet. Here we have the 5th grade text right here. On level reader. These were all the sophisticated vocabulary. Look at how sophisticated the words were in this particular text. Huge. It's all about an owl that was living in the Christmas tree in Rockefeller Center. So the one word that was really important was raptor, because owls are raptors. Like that's the type of bird they're carnivores and they're called raptors. But all these other words were in the 5th grade text. Okay. Now, what I used to do, I don't anymore, know better, do better. But what I used to do is if a student was struggling, I would go down a level or two and I would give them a lower level text. But here's what we find. See all these beautiful words, and look at how beautiful these words were: undomesticated, nonprofit, rehabilitate, iconic, vocabulary that makes us better comprehenders. Look what happens. Gone. None of these words are in this text. So as I go down to 620, I looked and I'm like, where did all these words go? Nope, they were gone. The most challenging words in the 620 lexile were these. Now, granted, you might say, okay, my ELs might still struggle with some of those words. But you guys, all this fabulous 5th grade words, gone. And now the most challenging word is preparing or impressed. But then I went down another level, because I had kids who they were multiple grade levels behind, right? So I went down one more level. All of these beautiful words, gone. These were the most challenging words in the text. So maybe rescue, that would be the hardest word. Tucked, that wasn't so bad. But the vocabulary really was simplified, and my kids lost access to grade level content and vocab. And remember, we just said for ELs, every author that you can read says vocabulary is the most important thing. And we just took away all that fabulous vocabulary. And I'm just going to tell you, the research does not support leveling down. The research says you want to close the gap, give kids complex text. Oh my gosh, Chris, I'm so glad you asked, does this apply to grammar as well? Oh, hallelujah. Because what I was going to have you all do, if you had time, was I was going to ask you to look at these 3, and we might actually ask you, take a look at these 3 texts for a second at 3 levels. What happens to the language structure and the grammar? Because I think you're going to find that gets simplified too, significantly. So what does that mean for closing the gap when they end up with significantly easier language, less vocabulary, less access to standard English grammar, syntax, and structure? What are your thoughts? Christy said, what if they can't decode the text? We have to help them by scaffolding our instruction. And there is no research that supports the independent +1. If you have a question about it, Tim Shanahan did a whole session where he has a list of all the studies that show giving kids complex text close the gap. And we got to know better, do better, move forward. It's okay. With teacher support, yes. So we read the more challenging texts with teacher support, scaffolding. So there are things I can do before giving them the text to help them and to work with them. And that's the point of your intervention, right? Is to be there scaffolding and helping them.
So K1 and 2 students, you're going to be doing those as read aloud, even with our
yeah. 2, by grade 2, they should be reading complex text, but yeah.
Those are read alouds. Yeah, we're not handing a kindergartner a complex text. We are reading aloud. We're getting their brains primed, preschoolers. We're getting their brains primed to hear and understand that language.
I know, Mackenzie, I understand your worry. I get it. I'm just going to be really clear on what the research says. Our goal is to close the gap for these kids. and we are perpetuating inequity. And our differentiation is in our instruction, not the text. So we change. I'm actually going to link Tim Shanahan's session on this because he has, there's like 2 slides worth of research on this. And Tim Shanahan's session at the Literacy Academy was super powerful. Go ahead, Dana.
I just want to throw out maybe some researchers where they might recognize the names that back up this idea of using grade level texts. Aida Waki has done work around this. She's out of West Ed's, Catherine Snow, Kate Kinsella. There was somebody else on the tip of my tongue. So those are some names that you may know from the EL research and world that also back this up with these other researchers that Michelle is sharing. But I think that this is something that we can delve in further on that 4th session, as Carolyn said, because I think this was a tough topic right at the end of the evening.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. It is. But I want you guys, I want to challenge your thinking. And that's why I made you all smile first, because I knew I was going to be like coming in and like, I call it kicking your puppy moments. It's like I just walked in and kicked your puppy and you just look so sad. And I don't want to make you sad and I don't want to kick your puppies. But trust me, somebody kicked mine and I'm okay. And I think I'm better for it, right? And is this for read aloud or groups? Both. Mm-hmm. This is for both, Joe. Yeah, we want to read. So read aloud should always be above grade level or above. And then reading with students, we scaffold, and we as teachers scaffold our instruction. And so we're going to provide more support. And I will share a session I did called Scaffolding Complex Text with a bunch of practical strategies you could use to scaffold complex text with your students. And so I will put that in there as well. But I want you guys to start thinking about this. And someone said, how do I build background knowledge? I'm going to show you this really good slide because we want to use, Tim Shanahan calls them stair-step text. But here I have an article from Lupo that talks about using multiple texts where some of them are a little easier to kind of build the knowledge. And then we get them and build them up to this really challenging text. But everybody gets the easier moving up to the more challenging text. And it's not levels. Some of them might be just a paragraph or a graphic organizer or a video. And then we're going to have a slightly more accessible text that maybe has some more context clues before we jump into that really complicated, complex text. But we want kids to be given access to complex grade level text because that's what they're going to see on the state tests. That's what they're going to see in all other encounters. We want to give them access to the grade level standards because who are we to say that they shouldn't have access to all of this wonderful, rich vocabulary from grade level text?
And this
is why we're simplifying and really perpetuating the gap for them.
And this is where, again, this takes an overall systemic response, because if you have older readers who are still not able to decode the words on the page, they need interventions on how to decode the words on the page. And that's not easily done without a kind of an intervention, block or time to allow them to do that. And you have to have those intervention blocks. You have to have that very specific informal diagnostic testing to see where they are in that process. And that just doesn't come. Those are responses that are most likely bigger than all of us on this call. But that's what it means to teach. We have to be able, all of this is in response to, you have to have word recognition and you have to have language comprehension, because that's what equals reading comprehension. And so it does take this coordinated systemic response. So if you can share this with your school leaders, or if you have a connection or an in with somebody as they can, keep sharing this information up the ranks and the ladders, that's what we want to see and hear.
And I love the comment that just said, Chris, it's not saying just give them grade level text and walk away. It's scaffolding grade level text so they can access it. We want to ensure that all students can access this grade level text, or what the heck is the point of giving it to them, right? But it's about raising the rigor and changing our instruction. And Shanahan says quite snarkily, because he's a snarky kind of guy, that when we use low level text, we take the teacher, we take the professional out of the equation, because they could do it all by themselves. They don't even need us. But when we use complex text, now we play a much bigger role because we have to teach them how to access this complex text.